listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the passage of time. For crimes, for lives, for acts of betrayal and murder that stretch across decades and cities like a black thread pulling history together into a pattern no one dares to see. These aren't just stories of greed and bloodlust. They are windows into the soul of a darker America, one that smiles on the surface but hides its rot underneath. Tonight, I'm going to take you through 4 historical crime cases each, one stranger, colder and more damning than the last. We'll start with the first name on our list, Louise Peete. Remember it. Speak it under your breath. Because her story isn't just about a murderer, it's about a woman who slipped past the moral boundaries of her time and forced the system to reveal how fragile its control really is. Peete was not just a killer. She was a master manipulator, a survivor, and perhaps one of the most chilling figures to ever walk into a courtroom. When you hear the details of her crimes, you will feel as though someone has opened a forbidden door that cannot be closed again. This is not the story of a single murder, it is a chain reaction of destruction, seduction, and death. Her life reads like a blueprint for chaos, and we are about to decode it, step by step. We begin in Louisiana, in the last decade of the 19th century, where a young girl named Lafe Louise Preslar is about to turn her charm into her first weapon. Everything you think you know about good and evil is about to be tested, because what this woman did will force you to question whether she was simply wicked or whether society itself built her. Stay with me. We are only at the edge of this darkness. Lafe Louise Preslar, known as Louise Peete, was born into comfort and privilege, the daughter of a respected newspaper publisher in Bienville, Louisiana. On paper, she should have grown up as a symbol of Southern refinement, but something darker was already moving inside her. By the time she was 15, her facade had cracked. She was expelled from her private school for stealing from classmates and indulging in what was delicately called promiscuous behavior. This was the first sign that Louise did not follow the rules meant for ordinary girls. She made her own, and soon that appetite for danger would turn lethal. In 1903, she married Henry Bosley, a traveling salesman. 4 years later, Henry was found dead by his own hand, or so the official story said. He had discovered Louise in bed with another man. Imagine this moment, a husband shattered, humiliated, choosing death over life with her. But here is where the darkness deepens. Some historians suspect Henry's suicide wasn't suicide at all. Did Louise push him into the final act? Did she quietly enjoy the power of watching his despair consume him? After his death, Louise moved to Shreveport and began working as a high-class prostitute, preying on wealthy men, stealing from them, using them, discarding them. The cycle of seduction and ruin was just beginning. But Louise wasn't finished. In 1911, she changed her name and her entire identity, moving to Boston and presenting herself as a 19-year-old heiress who had escaped the control of a cruel family. The wealthy of Boston took her in, charmed by her beauty and quick wit. But soon, she was charging luxury items to their accounts, draining their money, and stealing from their friends. When she was finally caught, the police allowed her to quietly leave town rather than publicly shame the family that had taken her in. This is the pattern we will see again and again. Institutions quietly covering up Louise's destruction, allowing her to slip away and start over somewhere new. She had learned something crucial, that charm was a weapon sharper than any blade, and that society was too polite to expose her for what she truly was. What happens when such a woman sets her sights on murder? We are about to find out. Louise drifted to Waco, Texas, and there her shadow grew darker. She met wealthy oil baron Joe Appel, a man whose fortune and power made him untouchable till he crossed her path. Just a week after they met, Joe Appel was found dead, shot, and stripped of his diamond jewelry. Suspicion instantly turned toward Louise, but she was ready. In court, she told a story that would play like theater. Appel had tried to rape her, and she killed him in self-defense. The jury believed her. She walked out free, a widowmaker with blood on her hands and no consequences to face. She had tasted death, and it hadn't stopped. Her hit had emboldened her. By 1913, Louise was in Dallas, married to Harry Staunton, a hotel night clerk who thought he had found a charming young wife. Shortly after their wedding, $20,000 worth of jewels disappeared from the hotel's safe. The police questioned Staunton, but could not prove he was involved. Suspicion soon shifted to Louise, but again, no evidence was strong enough to hold her. Then came the next death in her orbit. Ford supposedly shot himself, humiliated by the accusations and by Louise's endless infidelities. But here's the sinister detail: this death was just like Henry Bosley's, convenient, clean, final. Historians today suspect that Staunton didn't take his own life. He may have been another quiet victim of Louise's unstoppable ambition. By 1915, she had moved to Denver, married salesman Richard Peete, and given birth to a daughter named Frances Ann, known as Betty. For a time, it seemed like she might settle into a normal life. But Louise was incapable of ordinary happiness. Her marriage was turbulent, filled with fights and accusations, until she finally left Richard and Betty behind in 1920 and moved to Los Angeles. There, Louise's most infamous crime awaited her. Los Angeles in the 1920s was a city of new fortunes and new opportunities, a place where con artists and dreamers rubbed shoulders. It was here that Louise met Jacob C. Denton, a wealthy widower with a teenage daughter and a fortune made in mining. Denton owned a 14-room Tudor Revival mansion, and when Louise inquired about renting it, he agreed astonishingly for a fraction of his asking price. Within days of moving in, Denton vanished. This was no coincidence. Louise had just stepped onto the stage of her most chilling performance yet. Denton's disappearance became the pivot point where Louise's dark psychology fully revealed itself. She wasted no time assuming control over the mansion and everything that came with it. The very first thing she did was hire a gardener and ordered dirt to be brought into the basement, claiming she wanted to grow mushrooms underground. Days later, she forged Denton's signature to withdraw money from his bank account and access his safe deposit box. When bank staff noticed the signature didn't look right, she spun an outrageous lie. Denton had been shot by a mysterious Spanish-looking woman, and his right arm had been amputated. So she was helping him write checks with his left hand. This was the first of many versions of her story, each more grotesque and theatrical than the last, sometimes involving swords, mutilations, and secret shame. While Denton's friends and business associates grew suspicious and pressed her for answers, Louise remained calm, smiling, inventing stories to explain his absence. Meanwhile, she lived like a queen in Denton's house. She drove his Cadillac through the streets of Los Angeles, pawned his jewelry, collected rent from his properties, and even convinced tenants in Arizona to make rent checks out to her. She dressed in finery, dined well, and presented herself as Mrs. Denton, the grieving wife who claimed her husband was away on business. This wasn't survival, it was domination. She was rewriting reality, turning the house of a murdered man into her private stage. But reality has a way of clawing through lies. Denton's teenage daughter eventually hired an attorney. And with Louise gone back to Denver, the attorney's detectives searched the mansion. On September 23, 1920, they made a discovery that stunned even hardened investigators: Denton's body, decomposing and bound in cords, buried in a makeshift cubicle under the basement stairs, wrapped in a quilt like a grotesque secret. The autopsy revealed he had been shot in the head and strangled. The mushroom story had been a cover for a burial. Police tracked Louise down in Denver and brought her back to Los Angeles, where she offered a kaleidoscope of excuses, each one collapsing under its own weight. The trial that followed would grip the nation. Newspapers sensationalized every detail. Thousands came just to watch her enter the courthouse, her face composed, her presence magnetic. And when the verdict came guilty of first-degree murder, Louise was sentenced to life in prison. But prison would not be the end of her story. It was just another stage for her next act. Louise Peete's first prison sentence should have been the end of her reign of terror, but in truth, it was merely a pauser recalibration of a predator whose instincts had been sharpened by decades of evading justice. She was sent to San Quentin State Prison before being transferred to the California Institution for Women in Tehachapi, where she became what authorities called a model prisoner. She worked as a dental assistant, tended the prison's gardens, and even wrote for the prison newspaper. To those who observed her, Louise appeared to have been rehabilitated, a woman who had paid her dues. But appearances are dangerous. For 18 years, she played the part flawlessly, cultivating trust, charm, and a reputation for good behavior. When she was paroled in 1939, the system believed she had been reformed, and a woman named Jessie Marcy, who had lobbied for Louise's release, took her into her home. Marcy's death shortly after Louise moved in went uninvestigated, a silent curtain falling over another victim. Louise then moved in with her probation officer, Emily Latham. Latham's death in 1943, attributed to a heart attack, was also never scrutinized. Louise had learned the subtle art of using authority, goodwill, and institutional trust as camouflage. She had transformed from murderer to invisible predator, slipping under the radar of a world eager to see her rehabilitated. By 1944, Louise had embedded herself in the home of Arthur and Margaret Logan, elderly clients who had supported her prison release. Here, she applied her full mastery of psychological manipulation. Arthur, mentally incompetent and suffering from dementia, was rendered powerless. Margaret, convinced of Louise's innocence, welcomed her into the household. Louise became their nurse, housekeeper, and trusted companion. But underneath that veneer of care, the machinery of death had already been set in motion. On June 1, 1944, Margaret disappeared. Louise claimed Arthur had attacked her, that he had gone into seclusion for plastic surgery, inventing a story so outlandish it could have only been designed to shield her own crime. For 6 months, she continued to occupy the home, spending the couple's money, forging checks, controlling their assets. The law, distracted and unknowing, let her operate unchecked. Arthur died committed in a state hospital, his body donated to science at Louise's behest. Margaret's fate remained a secret until December 20th, when police discovered her decomposing body buried under an avocado tree. Louise Peete, once again, had eluded justice for months. Every action, every lie, Every murder had been a precise calculation, exploitation of societal blind spots, legal leniency, and human trust. This was no accident. This was mastery. You were witnessing a pattern of darkness repeated across decades. A predator refining her methods until she became nearly untouchable. And yet the final act is still to come. When Louise Peete was finally arrested for the murder of Margaret Logan, the full weight of her deception began to unravel. She claimed Arthur Logan had killed his wife in a homicidal frenzy, and though Arthur had died months earlier, she continued the performance, weeping and blaming herself for the fallout. But investigators were relentless this time. They uncovered forged checks, manipulated finances, and a 6-month trail of lies that exposed the meticulous nature of her crimes. Louise's husband, Lee Borden Judson, had been an unwitting participant in her scheme. He was charged alongside her, but released when evidence failed to implicate him. Within days, Judson committed suicide, jumping from a building, leaving a note that made it clear Louise's shadow had consumed him. She wept publicly, claiming responsibility, yet the truth remained darker than she let anyone see. The psychological manipulation in Louise's story is profound. She controlled perception, law, and human behavior with precision, turning every institution meant to protect society into a tool that aided her. When her trial began in April 1945, prosecutors painted a picture of calculated greed, deception, and cold-blooded murder. They argued that she killed Margaret Logan to gain control of her finances, a theory supported by her history of forging checks, manipulating wealthy men, and moving seamlessly from one victim to another. The courtroom was silent as Louise, ever composed, read a philosophical book, The Importance of Living by Lin Yutang, while the sentence was being read. Her detachment was chilling a woman who could witness her own condemnation with curiosity, almost amusement, her mind clearly a fortress of control and calculation. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death in the gas chamber. In April 1947, Louise Peete became the second woman in California's history executed by the state, closing the chapter on a life built from manipulation, murder, and the exploitation of trust. But her story leaves something more disturbing behind. The systems meant to stop her, the courts, the families, the police were consistently outmaneuvered, not by chance, but by the brilliance of a mind trained in deceit. This is not merely history. It is a lesson in the fragility of human institutions, in how charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness can exploit blind spots in every layer of society. It is a story that whispers a warning to those who assume morality and law are enough to contain the darkness among us. Louise Peete's legacy is not just in the body she left behind, is in the invisible fingerprints of fear, control, and systemic failure that she imprinted across decades. Now, we turn to our next case, one that unfolds in London in 1877, where another web of cruelty, manipulation, and death would shock Victorian society to its core. Now, we step back to Victorian London, April of 1877, to the quiet suburb of Penge, where a horror unlike anything else in the city's history quietly unfolded. Harriet Staunton, a woman of limited mental capacity and a small inheritance, became the center of a calculated nightmare orchestrated by her husband, Louis Staunton, and a circle of relatives. What appears at first glance to be domestic cruelty is, upon closer inspection, a meticulously planned system of psychological and physical oppression. Harriet gave birth to a son, Thomas, in 1876, but almost immediately. Her world and the world around her was poisoned. Louis bought a home called Little Grays and moved in with his lover, Alice Rhodes, leaving Harriet and her child confined to a small, unsanitary room at Frith Cottage under the watch of Louis's brother, Patrick, and his wife, Elizabeth. The confinement was total. Harriet was threatened with violence if she left. Curtains, furniture, proper washing facilities, none existed for her. She became a ghost in her own life, trapped under the care of those meant to be family. In early 1877, Thomas became gravely ill, malnourished and bruised, a silent testimony to the brutality inflicted upon him. Taken to Guy's Hospital, he died on April 8th, 5 days before Harriet herself would succumb to neglect and starvation, weighed down to just 74 pounds. Her death certificate cited cerebral disease, but the truth, revealed in the subsequent investigation, was far darker: starvation, filth, and human cruelty in its most intimate form. What makes this case extraordinary is the level of collusion and calculation. Louis, Patrick, Elizabeth, and Alice Rhodes were all implicated in what can only be described as systemic, familial exploitation culminating in murder. The authorities' initial disbelief, the need for a brother-in-law to push the case forward, reflects how easy it is for cruelty to hide in plain sight, even under the scrutiny of Victorian morality. When the trial came, presided over by Judge Henry Hawkins, the courtroom itself became a theatre for society's fascination with depravity. Wealthy spectators observed through opera glasses, champagne in hand, as the verdict guilty on all counts was read. Yet even here, the story of corruption and suppression continued. Medical testimony suggesting alternate causes of death was ignored. Bias from the bench was evident, and only after intense public and professional pressure were the death sentences commuted. The Staunton case is not merely a story of murder. It is a chilling portrait of human cruelty amplified by social structures, a psychological blueprint of how ambition, lust, and greed can co-opt family, law, and medicine to destroy life quietly, systematically, and with terrifying precision. This is where the descent deepens, where family becomes weapon and innocence becomes currency for cruelty. The horror of the Staunton household extends beyond the simple acts of neglect. It is the architecture of control and fear that makes this case a study in psychological domination. Harriet Staunton, already vulnerable due to her limited mental capacity, was systematically stripped of autonomy. Her every movement was monitored, every attempt at escape violently suppressed. When she tried to flee in October 1876, Patrick Staunton assaulted her, a brutal reminder that disobedience had consequences. The psychological weight of confinement: no curtains, no proper furniture, no washing facilities, was compounded by constant intimidation. Harriet's mother, desperate to intervene, was turned away at every turn, silenced by letters purportedly written by her daughter, letters crafted by the very people orchestrating her torment. Louis Stanton's strategy was meticulous. Isolate Harriet from all sources of support, control her environment, and manipulate the perception of those around her. Even the child, Thomas, became a pawn in this sinister game. His malnutrition and injuries were not accidental. They were the byproduct of a calculated regime designed to exert dominance over the helpless. When Thomas was finally taken to Guy's Hospital, the damage was irreparable. Harriet followed just days later, her body and spirit broken. The case then shifted into the public sphere, exposing not just the brutality of one family, but the complicity of societal structures. The police only acted after Harriet's brother-in-law, Louis Casabianca, recognized the signs of foul play and pushed for an inquest. When the investigators arrived, they found a scene that could have been taken from a nightmare. A body malnourished, infested with lice, hair matted, and clothing soiled, a human being reduced to almost nothing. Yet the initial death certificate, citing cerebral disease, highlights another layer of corruption and oversight, an institutional failure to acknowledge and act on evidence of cruelty. The trial that followed was as much a spectacle as a judicial proceeding. The accused were watched by a curious society eager for scandal, and the verdict of guilty was cheered by crowds outside. Yet the very same trial revealed deep flaws: biased judging, ignored medical testimony, and public manipulation. The Staunton case is a stark reminder that human cruelty is rarely isolated. It exists within systems familial, legal, medical, that can be co-opted by those with ambition, malice, or lust for control. As we move forward, you will see a chilling continuity in human behavior, across time and geography, from the quiet streets of Penge to the wild landscapes of Queensland, Australia, where the next case demonstrates that the mind capable of charm and trust can also orchestrate unimaginable violence. You are about to witness the next layer of darkness, and it begins with a young girl named Ivy Mitchell, whose death would ignite fear across a nation. Returning to the United States, we step into the world of Louise Peete once more, a woman whose life reads like a manual in manipulation, deceit, and cold-blooded calculation. Released on parole in 1939 after serving 18 years for her first murder, Peete did not retreat from society, she infiltrated it. She became a housekeeper, a nurse, a confidant, someone trusted by the vulnerable and the wealthy alike. Her victims were not chosen at random. They were carefully selected for their dependence, for their wealth, for the access they granted to her insatiable ambition. Margaret Logan, an elderly woman who had advocated for Pete's release, seemed the perfect target, trusting, influential, and vulnerable. Peete embedded herself in Logan's life, subtly asserting control, manipulating perceptions, and isolating her victims psychologically. When Logan disappeared on June 1st, 1944, Peete had already begun constructing the narrative to protect herself. She claimed Logan had been attacked by her husband, or had gone into seclusion for plastic surgery stories, so audacious that only the most gullible might have believed them. Meanwhile, Peete assumed full control of Logan's assets, forged checks, and began living in Logan's home as if she owned it. The psychological audacity of her actions is staggering. She manipulated not only her victims, but an entire community, exploiting trust, social norms, and legal naivety. 6 months passed before police discovered Logan's body buried beneath an avocado tree in her own backyard. Peete was arrested, and the investigation revealed a disturbing truth. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was a crime of strategy, patience, and foresight, carried out with chilling precision. Even her husband, Lee Borden Judson, became an instrument of her narrative, falsely implicated in Logan's death, ultimately choosing suicide over the disgrace Peete had orchestrated. Her trial in 1945 was not just about murder. It was a revelation of systemic vulnerability, showing how a single mind, unencumbered by morality and armed with intelligence and charm, could bend institutions, exploit social trust, and commit atrocities while evading detection. As Peete faced the gas chamber, she maintained an eerie composure, reading philosophy while her fate was sealed, a final act of psychological dominance over those who judged her. Her story is more than history. It is a lesson in the fragility of social structures, a warning about the predators who walk among us, cloaked in normalcy, trust, and charm. And now, as we prepare to cross the Atlantic once more, steel yourself, for the next case plunges us into the chilling streets of London, where the Staunton tragedy left scars not just on a family, but on an entire society, revealing how human cruelty can thrive when systems fail and complicity reigns. But before we continue, take a moment, comment below from where you are watching. Let the world know your presence in this unfolding journey into darkness. We return to London, 1877, where the Staunton case left an indelible mark on Victorian society, exposing the rot hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. Harriet Staunton's death was not merely a private tragedy. It was a reflection of systemic failure. Wealth, social standing, and the credibility of the perpetrators created a shield that almost allowed their crimes to go unpunished. The courtroom spectacle, the opera glasses, and the cheering crowds were not a celebration of justice, they were a fascination with the macabre. A society complicit in voyeurism, while ignoring the true horrors that had unfolded behind closed doors. Judge Henry Hawkins, whose bias was later questioned, presided over a trial where medical testimony suggesting alternative causes of death was dismissed. 700 physicians protested the ignoring of expert evidence, highlighting the tension between institutional authority and scientific truth. This case exposes a pattern that will echo through the other stories you will witness. Human cruelty amplified by structural indifference, and the ability of a calculated mind to manipulate perception, evade accountability, and exploit trust. Harriet's confinement, Thomas's death, and the psychological torture inflicted were symptoms of a deeper pathology of family willing to weaponize love, loyalty, and social bonds to achieve power and control. And yet, even with all evidence pointing to premeditation, society needed a spectacle, a narrative, and a dramatic verdict to acknowledge the horror. The Stauntons' sentences were commuted, demonstrating the limits of justice when confronted with societal fascination, institutional bias, and the manipulation of moral authority. This is the environment in which cruelty can flourish. Systems designed to protect become tools of oppression when those in power exploit them. As we move from the foggy streets of London to the rural landscapes of Queensland, Australia, remember this. Each of these cases, though separated by oceans and decades, shares a core truth. Predators are not born in isolation. They are shaped and emboldened by the failures of those around them. Ernest Austin, like Louise Staunton, understood how to manipulate trust, exploit institutional blind spots, and turn society's structures against the innocent. Ivy Mitchell's death is a chilling continuation of this pattern, showing that cruelty does not need privilege to thrive. It only requires opportunity and the will to dominate. And as we prepare to descend into the psychology of Austin, notice the recurring motif. Innocence becomes a tool, compliance becomes a weapon, and society itself becomes an unwitting accomplice. Now, steel your resolve, because we are about to examine the mind of a predator who perfected this formula, leaving a mark on history that would haunt Queensland and beyond for decades. The darkness is not only in the act, it is in the system that allowed it to happen. Queensland, June 1913, a rural landscape bathed in late afternoon light, became the stage for a crime that would shock a nation. 11-year-old Ivy Mitchell walked home along dirt roads connecting the scattered farms near Sanford, unaware that the predator she had unknowingly encountered was already studying her, learning her movements, anticipating her vulnerabilities. Ernest Austin, a man whose criminal record spanned theft, assault, and violent predation, had been observing the patterns of life in this small community. When Ivy and her companion parted ways, Austin's instincts, honed over decades of escalating crime, activated with calculated precision. He followed her into the thickening shadows, leaving only the subtle signatures of his presence, hoofprints from his horse, the soft indent of his boot soles, meticulously altered to avoid identification. The Mitchell family, initially unaware of the growing danger, followed the faint traces of a trail that would lead them into a confrontation with death itself. In the dense scrubland behind Parker State School, Ivy's body was discovered, her throat brutally cut, evidence of sexual assault marking the final violation of her innocence. Nearby, hoof marks and a discarded riding crop told the story of a methodical escape. A predator confident in his ability to elude justice. The meticulous nature of Austin's preparation, the removal of boot soles, the calculated flight on horseback reveals a mind attuned to manipulation and evasion. A mind that treats life and death as components of a strategy game. When arrested, Austin's past surfaced, a chilling trail of escalating predation that began with petty theft and culminated in murder. His conviction and execution at Bogo Road Jail ended his life, but not the haunting imprint of his actions on the community. This case exposes a recurring truth across history. Human systems, no matter how structured, are vulnerable to those who understand their weaknesses, who exploit trust, legal gaps, and social assumptions. Ivy Mitchell's death illustrates not only the personal tragedy of a life stolen, but the systemic failure to prevent a recurring pattern mirrored in every case we explore in this series. It is here, in the quiet devastation left behind, that we confront the unsettling reality. Evil often masquerades as normalcy, and those who study human behavior closely enough can manipulate both people and institutions with terrifying efficiency. As we prepare to cross back to the United States, remember this chilling principle. The predator does not always strike in secrecy. Sometimes society itself provides the perfect cover. And it is only when we peel back the layers of deception that the true horror emerges. Up next, we enter the calculated, manipulative world of Louise Peete, a woman whose charm and intelligence masked a lethal obsession with control and death, proving that darkness can wear 1,000 faces, each more deceptive than the last dot. Now, we return to the United States in the mid-1940s, to the dark and calculated world of Louise Peete, a woman whose crimes reveal the terrifying potential of charm intertwined with cold-blooded calculation. Peete had already served 18 years for a previous murder, yet upon release she did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, she became a master of manipulation, embedding herself into the lives of the wealthy and vulnerable, exploiting trust, empathy, and social conventions as tools of control. Her next target, Margaret Logan, was an elderly woman who had lobbied for Pete's release, embodying the perfect combination of influence and vulnerability. Peete moved into Logan's home under the guise of loyalty and caregiving, presenting herself as indispensable while silently orchestrating her victim's demise. The disappearance of Margaret on June 1, 1944, marked the execution of Pete's psychological strategy. She wove an elaborate narrative to shield herself, claiming Logan had been attacked by her husband, or had gone into seclusion for plastic surgery. For 6 months, she controlled the environment, managed the narrative, and accessed Logan's finances, demonstrating not only her audacity but her mastery of social engineering. Peete's actions reveal a disturbing truth. Predation does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, seduces, and manipulates. The power of a predator lies not only in physical control, but in the ability to dominate perception, to bend reality around their will. Even her husband, Lee Borden Judson, became an unwitting pawn, falsely implicated in Logan's death and ultimately driven to suicide. The investigation that eventually uncovered Margaret's body revealed Peete's methodical approach. She had buried her victim in the backyard, concealed her crime through deception, and relied on societal assumptions to delay discovery. The audacity, patience, and precision of her crimes demonstrate that some redditors operate not through chaos, but through calculated, sustained manipulation of both people and systems. Peete's trial in 1945 revealed the terrifying extent of her influence. Newspapers nationwide sensationalized her story, yet few grasped the systemic failures her actions exploited. Her execution by gas chamber in 1947 did not erase the lessons her life imparts, that intelligence and charm, unrestrained by morality, can weaponize social structures, exploit empathy, and create enduring horror. As we step back into history, consider the patterns linking these cases: Harriet Staunton, Ivy Mitchell, Ernest Austin, and Louise Peete. Each story is a thread in a tapestry of human malevolence, showing how cruelty exploits systems, trust, and perception. Now, pause and reflect. Comment below the phrase, "I see the darkness twice," for those who acknowledge the hidden truths within human history and the shadows that walk among us. Stay alert, because the next section plunges us back to Victorian London, where institutional failure and human cruelty intertwined to produce one of the most infamous family horrors of the 19th century. Victorian London, 1877. The fog hung thick over the streets of Penge, but the darkness inside Little Gray's and Frith Cottage was far thicker, heavier, more suffocating. Harriet Staunton, a woman of limited understanding but profound vulnerability, was trapped not by walls alone but by the calculated malice of those who should have protected her: her husband Louis, his brother Patrick, and their complicit wives. Confinement was only the surface of her torment. Psychological control, the insidious threats, the constant manipulation, and the isolation were the instruments of her destruction. Imagine a 1-year-old child, Thomas, malnourished to the point of near death, a human life reduced to a pawn in a web of greed and cruelty. The family's wealth and social connections shielded them, just as systems today often shield predators from immediate accountability. Mrs. Butterfield, Harriet's mother, attempted to intervene, to pierce the veil of secrecy and cruelty, yet her efforts were met with deceit and obstruction. When the child was finally taken to Guy's Hospital, it was already too late. Thomas died, and Harriet followed days later, a corpse in life, her body ravaged by neglect, starvation, and violence. The courtroom became a theater for societal fascination, not moral reckoning. Opera glasses and champagne marked a public consumed by curiosity rather than conscience, eager to witness punishment yet blind to the systemic failures that allowed such suffering to unfold. Even the judge's bias and the dismissal of medical expertise demonstrate a recurring theme in these stories. Institutions designed to deliver justice can, under pressure and prejudice, become instruments of further injustice. The Staunton case is more than a historical tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of society when cruelty and manipulation exploit both human weakness and structural blind spots. Patterns emerge, echoed in other times and places. Predators thrive not solely on malice, but on the complacency of observers, on the deference of authority, and on the trust society places in the wrong hands. As we leave London's fog and traverse decades and continents, notice the common threads, the use of deception, the premeditation, the ability to manipulate both people and systems. These are not random acts of violence. They are calculated expressions of human malevolence, rehearsed and executed with precision. And now, brace yourself, because we descend further into the psychology of Ernest Austin, whose predation in Queensland reveals how innocence and community trust can be weaponized with devastating effect. Each case pushes us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil often walks among the ordinary, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when systems fail, and the vulnerable can no longer be protected. Queensland, 1913. The story of Ivy Mitchell is not just a tale of murder, it is a study in the meticulous psychology of a predator who understood how to manipulate both environment and human expectation. Ernest Austin had spent decades honing his craft, starting with petty theft and escalating to assault and ultimately murder. His understanding of human behavior, timing, and social trust was chillingly advanced. On that fateful day in June, he followed Ivy along the dirt roads, studying her every move, anticipating where her path would make her vulnerable. The footprints that joined hers were more than physical evidence. They were the calculated signature of a mind that treated life as expendable and patterns as tools. Austin removed the soles of his boots to confuse investigators, erased traces, and fled on horseback with deliberate markers that misled all who would follow. When Ivy's body was discovered, the horror was compounded not only by the violence inflicted upon her, but by the realization of the predator's patience, his understanding of societal blind spots, and his confidence in evading detection. This was a man who knew that systems fail when confronted with cunning and preparation. The investigation revealed Austin's prior offenses, yet each had escalated without meaningful intervention, proof of how social structures, prison systems, and community oversight can be circumvented by those who observe them closely. Austin's eventual capture and execution closed a chapter, but the case remains a study in how criminal intelligence exploits weakness, trust, and routine. The lessons are stark. Evil does not always announce itself. It often wears the mask of normality, waits patiently, and strikes when opportunity aligns perfectly with preparation. Just as Harriet Staunton's torment was facilitated by her family's betrayal and institutional indifference, Ivy Mitchell's death was enabled by a predator's understanding of societal assumptions, the rural isolation of her environment, and the gaps in human vigilance. Both cases echo a deeper, almost universal principle. Systems can be manipulated, trust weaponized, and innocence turned into a tool for control. And as we transition to Louise Peete's story in California, recognize the continuity. What connects these crimes across continents and decades is not coincidence, but a pattern of exploitation, calculation, and the leveraging of human vulnerability. Peete's manipulation of her victims through charm, trust, and carefully constructed deception mirrors Austin's exploitation of opportunity, showing that the methods of predation evolve, but the underlying psychology remains constant. These are not isolated horrors. They are manifestations of a recurring truth about human history, that malevolence thrives when intelligence and moral blindness intersect. Halfway through this journey, I want you to pause, reflect, and engage. Comment below from where you are watching this video. Acknowledge your place in this world of hidden truths. Then, comment the phrase, "I see the darkness twice," a symbolic gesture of understanding the patterns of manipulation, control, and horror that lie beneath the surface of society. Your engagement marks your awareness, your recognition that history's shadows are never as distant as they seem. Now, we step into the chilling narrative of Louise Peete's return to society after 18 years behind bars. A woman whose life demonstrates the terrifying potential of intelligence, charm, and unrestrained ambition twisted toward destruction. Released on parole in 1939, Peete did not fade quietly into anonymity. Instead, she re-entered the world with a single goal: control. Her first moves were calculated, subtle, and audacious. She ingratiated herself into the lives of the elderly and vulnerable, using her cultivated persona of innocence and loyalty as armor. Margaret Logan, her eventual victim, represents a perfect case study in predation cloaked in trust, a woman who had championed Peete's release. Unknowingly placing herself directly in the path of lethal manipulation, Peete moved in as a housekeeper, a caregiver, a seemingly indispensable figure, all while meticulously plotting Logan's disappearance. When Margaret vanished, Peete spun an elaborate web of deception, blaming her husband or inventing fictitious circumstances to justify the absence. 6 months passed with neighbors unaware, authorities uninformed, and Peete freely accessing the finances and property of her victim. Her audacity demonstrates a principle often hidden in true crime. The most dangerous predators are those who understand social assumptions, who exploit empathy, and who manipulate perception to bend reality to their will. Even her husband, Lee Borden Judson, became an unwitting participant, falsely accused and ultimately driven to suicide under the weight of orchestrated narrative. Margaret Logan's murder was not a crime of impulse. It was a meticulously executed strategy, a demonstration of control over human perception, legal systems, and social norms. Peete's success in delaying discovery underscores a broader, unsettling truth. Societal structures, while designed to protect, often provide cover for those willing to manipulate them. When police finally uncovered Margaret's decomposed body, 6 months after her disappearance, the extent of Peete's planning became undeniable. Every aspect from deception to financial exploitation, from narrative control to environmental manipulation, was calculated to maximize advantage and minimize risk. The revelation of her crime shook the nation, exposing how easily social trust can be weaponized. For those studying the psychology of crime, Peete's actions offer a masterclass in strategic manipulation and the exploitation of systemic blind spots. As we prepare to transition back to Victorian London, remember this principle: darkness often operates through subtlety, patience, and perception. It is rarely brute force alone that allows evil to flourish. It is the combination of intelligence, manipulation, and systemic vulnerability. In the next section, we descend once more into the harrowing reality of Harriet Staunton's final days, exploring not just her physical torment, but the psychological machinery of control that orchestrated her demise, a mechanism frighteningly effective, eerily familiar across time and space. We return now to the cold, gaslit streets of Victorian London, to the suffocating rooms of Frith Cottage, where Harriet Staunton and her infant son, Thomas, endured a nightmare hidden in plain sight. This was not just confinement. It was psychological domination perfected through isolation, intimidation, and the manipulation of trust. Harriet's every movement was monitored, her ability to act freely stripped away, while Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton ensured that fear became the primary language of her existence. Threats of violence, coercion, and relentless deprivation created a controlled environment where the victim's will was systematically eroded. Even the most basic acts, leaving her room, tending to her child, seeking help from her mother, were obstructed or punished. Witness the cruel geometry of control. The room itself was weaponized, a tool of subjugation, stripped of curtains, furniture, or privacy. The boy Thomas, only a year old, became collateral damage in a meticulously orchestrated power play. His cries ignored, his malnutrition allowed to progress unchecked. A testament to the calculated cruelty of the perpetrators. Society outside Frith Cottage, represented by Mrs. Butterfield, Harriet's mother, was ineffective. Attempts to intervene were blocked, distorted, or dismissed. Letters were manipulated, visits denied, and legal interventions stymied. This reflects a broader historical pattern. Institutions, designed to protect, are frequently exploited by those who understand the weaknesses, biases, and blind spots of authority. When the child was finally taken to Guy's Hospital, it was a desperate, belated attempt to intervene, but even medical systems were ill-equipped to reverse months of systematic neglect. Harriet's own death followed only days later, her body a physical record of torment, a narrative of control and cruelty written in flesh and bone. Yet the horror did not end with death. In the courtroom, the mechanisms of justice were corrupted by social spectacle and prejudice. Opera glasses and champagne transformed a trial into theater. The presiding judge's bias tainted proceedings, and expert medical testimony was disregarded. The public cheered, captivated by the drama, oblivious to the deeper systemic failures that enabled such cruelty. Here lies the lesson that echoes across time. Evil thrives when perception is manipulated, authority is compromised, and observers are distracted by spectacle. Harriet Staunton's story is a precursor to patterns repeated in the 20th century. From Ivy Mitchell to Louise Peete, innocents preyed upon, systems exploited, and cruelty cloaked in ordinaries. As we transition next to Ernest Austin in Queensland, keep in mind the continuity, the sophistication of predation, the exploitation of both human trust and institutional weakness, and the terrifying precision with which some individuals wield control over life and death. Each story deepens the shadow, revealing that history is not just a record of events, but a map of darkness waiting to be recognized by those who dare to look. Queensland, 1913, Cedar Creek Road. The rural isolation that once seemed idyllic became the perfect stage for Ernest Austin's predation. Here, in plain sight of families who trusted him as a laborer, Austin enacted a plan that was both methodical and horrifying. 11-year-old Ivy Mitchell's footsteps were her last free ones, followed by the deliberate, larger prints of a man who understood both the terrain and human expectation. He tracked, isolated, and executed his crime with a precision that chilled investigators. He removed the soles of his boots, altered the marks left behind, and relied on his horse to erase the trail. A testament to a mind capable of anticipating every investigative move before it happened. The crime itself, the rape, the murder, the careful concealment, was not impulsive. It was calculated, rehearsed, a meticulous orchestration of power and dominance. Austin's history shows a pattern, a trajectory of escalating violence enabled by systemic oversight failures, childhood thefts, assaults, minor convictions that did not contain or rehabilitate him, and finally, the ultimate act of evil. Each step in his life illustrates how society's structures can be manipulated by those who understand their weaknesses. When Ivy's body was found, the horror extended beyond the act itself to the realization of its execution, the methodical, patient exploitation of trust, routine, and rural invisibility. In this moment, we confront a universal principle in the study of true crime. The danger lies not just in brute force, but in intellect applied without conscience. Communities, families, law enforcement were deceived, exploited, and rendered powerless against a predator who combined knowledge, patience, and malevolence. The trial and eventual execution of Austin did little to erase the psychological impact of his crime, nor the deeper lesson it imparts about systemic vulnerability and human naivety. Just as Harriet Staunton suffered under institutional failures and psychological domination, Ivy Mitchell's death exposes the same truth in a different time and place, that those who understand the machinery of society can bend it to their will, using rules, assumptions, and blind trust as instruments of harm. As we prepare to enter the dark narrative of Louise Peete's post-prison years, consider this continuity. Predators who wield intelligence, charm, and understanding of human behavior can orchestrate devastation in ways that systems are ill-equipped to anticipate. Peete's manipulation of elderly victims, her strategic deception, and her financial exploitation echo the predatory tactics of Austin, though separated by decades and continents. Each story layers upon the last, forming a tapestry of human malevolence, institutional vulnerability, and the fragility of innocence. You, the viewer, must recognize the thread that connects them. The same principles, repeated across time, shape the theater of hidden evil, waiting silently in the corners of history, ready to exploit the unwary. And as we descend further, the pattern becomes undeniably evil is intelligent, patient, and terrifyingly consistent. Now, we turn once more to California in the 1940s, to the unnerving world of Louise Peete, whose post-prison existence was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and strategic control. Peete had learned the hard lessons of the past. Charm, trust, and societal blind spots could be weaponized with terrifying efficiency. She ingratiated herself into the lives of the elderly, the vulnerable, and the unsuspecting, those whose empathy and goodwill she could bend to her purpose. Margaret Logan, a woman who had campaigned for Peete's release, became the perfect instrument of Peete's ambition. She welcomed Peete into her home, believing in the illusion of innocence that Peete so meticulously curated. What unfolded was a slow, deliberate conquest of both space and perception. Peete positioned herself as indispensable, caring for Arthur Logan while controlling the narrative of his wife's absence. For 6 months, she controlled information, exploited social trust, and reshaped reality around her, creating a reality in which no one questioned the disappearance. This was not mere crime. It was the art of psychological dominance, executed with patience and cunning. Peete's manipulation extended beyond the household. Her husband Judson became an unwitting accomplice, his reputation weaponized to deflect suspicion, ultimately leading to his tragic suicide. The murders, the deceptions, the forgeries, and the concealment of bodies all followed a single principle. Control is power. The more completely she could shape perception, the more unassailable her position became. Societies, mechanisms, banks, neighbors, and even law enforcement were rendered ineffective. Not through incompetence alone, but through Peete's exploitation of assumptions, trust, and the very rules meant to safeguard them. This is a lesson often ignored in discussions of historical crime. The most dangerous individuals are not always the overtly violent, but those who understand human behavior and exploit it. In Peete's world, charm was lethal, patience was a weapon, and perception could be manipulated to mask murder. When the authorities finally uncovered Margaret Logan's body, the depth of Peete's strategy became painfully evident. Every lie, every act of misdirection, every fabricated story had served a calculated purpose. For the modern observer, the horror is not just the murder itself, but the sophistication, the patience, and the understanding of human nature that enabled it. As we descend deeper into these cases, recognize a chilling pattern across time and place, whether in the cottages of London, the scrublands of Queensland, or the homes of California. Human vulnerability and systemic gaps are exploited by those who understand them best. And now, pause. Comment below from where you are watching this video. Let the world see the global reach of these truths. Recognize your position in the network of observation, awareness, and insight. For we are only halfway through our descent into the darkness that history has hidden in plain sight as we move forward. It is essential to examine the mechanisms that allowed Louise Peete to evade detection for so long. For within her story lies a masterclass in the exploitation of systemic weakness. After her parole in 1939, Peete did not simply return to society. She entered it as a predator fully aware of the blind spots she could manipulate. Her victims were chosen with precision, elderly, trusting, and socially respected individuals whose influence and credibility she could co-opt to her advantage. Margaret Logan was more than a victim. She was a symbol of how societal goodwill and faith in rehabilitation can be weaponized against the very people who extend it. Peete's control was not violent at first. It was psychological, administrative, and social. She embedded herself in the household routines, gained trust, and slowly rewrote reality around her. When Margaret disappeared, Peete had already laid the groundwork to manipulate perception, offering explanations that seemed plausible to those who had no reason to doubt her. The careful timing of her actions, the layering of deceit, and the use of her husband Judson as both confidant and unwitting scapegoat exemplify an intelligence that thrives on anticipation and foresight. This was a mind operating on the principle that control is ultimate power, that narrative domination can outpace brute force, and that human institutions often fail to detect manipulation until it is too late. Consider how she simultaneously exploited financial systems, forging checks, accessing accounts, and using her proximity to the elderly to extract resources with almost surgical precision. The murder itself was only part of the equation. The true danger lay in her ability to delay discovery, to shape truth, and to create a temporal buffer in which suspicion could not take root. Her story is a case study in the intersection of social psychology, criminology, and systemic vulnerability, revealing truths often hidden beneath the surface of sensational headlines. When authorities finally discovered Margaret Logan's decomposed body, the revelation was not just of a crime, but of a systematic orchestration of control and perception that had gone undetected for months. Peete's calculated patience mirrors the strategies of other historical predators we have examined. The psychological dominance in Frith Cottage, the calculated stalking of Ivy Mitchell, and the financial and social exploitation of Jacob Denton. Each case highlights a terrifying consistency. Predators who understand human behavior, trust, and institutional gaps can bend reality to their will. And now, before we continue our descent, I want you to engage with this narrative. Comment the phrase, "I see the darkness" twice in the comments below. Claim your awareness. Recognize that you are not merely observing history, you are decoding the hidden patterns of control that have shaped human behavior across centuries. The next section will take us back into Victorian London, revisiting Harriet Staunton's final moments and the psychological machinery that orchestrated them, revealing truths long suppressed by time and social complacency. We return now to London, April 1877, to the harrowing final days of Harriet Staunton, a woman whose life was extinguished in a way that exposes the darkest intersections of familial greed, institutional neglect, and psychological torment. Harriet was not merely a victim of physical abuse. She was trapped within a system designed to obscure, to silence, and to rationalize cruelty. Confined to a small windowless room in Frith Cottage, she and her infant son were deprived of the most basic necessities: sunlight, hygiene, and sustenance. Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton, along with Louise Staunton and Alice Rhodes, did not act out of spontaneous malice. They orchestrated a slow, relentless campaign of domination, isolation, and starvation. The horror here is in the method, in the deliberate calculation that allowed the suffering of mother and child to persist unnoticed by the world outside. Threats, physical violence, and psychological intimidation ensured compliance, while the social and legal structures of the time turned a blind eye. When Harriet's body was finally discovered, filthy, emaciated, and infested with lice, the revelation shocked the public but only partially illuminated the mechanisms that had enabled her death. Here, the tragedy is compounded by the failure of oversight. Neighbors, family members, and even initial authorities did not recognize the slow violence for what it was. The courtroom spectacle that followed opera glasses, champagne, and a jury enthralled by a melodramatic performance highlighted society's complicity, its morbid fascination with the suffering of the vulnerable, and the influence of performative justice. Expert medical testimony was dismissed, and prejudice-colored judgment, demonstrating that even in moments of supposed resolution, truth can be obscured by bias and social theater. The Staunton case, much like Austin and Peete's crimes decades later, illustrates the devastating power of calculated manipulation, physical control, financial exploitation, social positioning, and psychological terror combined to create a web of human suffering. Harriet's death forces us to confront a difficult truth, that evil does not always manifest as sudden violence. It often emerges as persistent, systematic exploitation, hidden behind routines, obedience, and societal norms. As we descend further, notice the recurring patterns: isolation, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust are the tools most often used by those who operate beyond the reach of conventional morality. The final moments of Harriet Staunton's life are not just historical events. They are a lens into the human capacity for cruelty, the fragility of institutional protections, and the terrifying effectiveness of psychological control. As we proceed, prepare to follow these threads into even darker terrain, where innocence is systematically broken and hidden truths are buried beneath layers of societal denial. Comment below from where you are watching. Become an active witness to these patterns, and recognize that awareness itself is the first step in decoding the machinery of hidden evil. Now, let us confront the calculated brutality of Ernest Austin, whose crimes in Queensland Australia exemplify a different, yet equally chilling, form of predation, one where instinct, cunning, and meticulous preparation converge to leave a trail of death almost undetected. On June 8, 1913, 11-year-old Ivy Mitchell vanished, walking home along a rural dirt road under the fading light. The innocence of her footsteps, small and precise, would soon be joined by a larger, deliberate set footprints that betrayed the presence of a predator who understood both the land and human expectation. Austin stalked, planned, and executed his attack with chilling precision. The crime scene bore the marks not just of violence, but of strategy. Crushed grass, traces of blood meticulously concealed, horse hoof marks indicating a premeditated escape. Witnesses would later recall seeing him that day. Seemingly benign, yet in reality, his actions were calculated to deflect suspicion. He removed the soles of his boots to avoid leaving identifiable prints, an act demonstrating a foresight that is often absent in impulsive violence. Here, we witness a mind that merges physical brutality with strategic calculation, a pattern that echoes across centuries of hidden crime, where the perpetrator's intelligence transforms the environment into a shield, a tool, and a narrative. Austin's criminal history, beginning at the age of 11, reveals a life steeped in the exploitation of opportunity and the bending of societal expectations. Each prior conviction, each period of incarceration, only honed his ability to manipulate systems of authority, to anticipate investigation, and to mask intent. When authorities finally connected the evidence matching altered boot soles, horse tracks, and witness accounts, the depth of Austin's premeditation became undeniable. His execution at Bogo Road Jail was both an end and a marker of systemic closure. Yet the psychological imprint of his actions lingers. The meticulous orchestration, the understanding of human and institutional behavior, and the deliberate avoidance of detection underscore a truth often ignored. Predators like Austin do not rely solely on violence. They exploit expectation, routine, and societal gaps, turning normalcy into camouflage. As we consider this case alongside Harriet Staunton's murder and Louise Peete's manipulations, a terrifying pattern emerges. The most dangerous acts are those that combine psychological control, environmental awareness, and the exploitation of trust and innocence. These crimes are lessons in both fear and understanding, a blueprint of how human systems can be outmaneuvered by those who study them, who understand the fragile threads of societal complacency, and who operate with patience and foresight. Recognize, as we continue, that these are not isolated events, they are part of a continuum of human darkness, waiting to be understood, dissected, and revealed. We now turn to Harry Fragson, whose story is different from the calculated murders we've examined, yet equally haunting, for it reveals the lethal consequences of family secrecy, mental instability, and unspoken tension simmering beneath the veneer of civility. Fragson-born Leon Philippe Pott had achieved fame and acclaim on stages in Paris and London, charming audiences with songs and laughter, his life appearing glamorous, controlled, and elevated. But fame cannot shield one from the shadows that dwell in the most intimate spaces, shadows that, in Fragson's case, emerged in the form of his father. Victor Pott, on December 31st, 1913, a day that should have been ordinary, mundane, and celebratory, Fragson returned home to confront a man teetering on the edge of self-destruction. Victor Pott, consumed by delusions and suspicion, accused his son of betrayal, of infidelity with a woman who existed only in the father's paranoid imagination. Words were exchanged, escalating into argument, and within moments, violence erupted. Fragson was shot at point-blank range by his own father, a man he had nurtured, obeyed, and perhaps even feared. The world of entertainment, the applause, the lights, the recordings could not protect him from the intimate, unpredictable danger that lurked within bloodlines. This act of domestic horror, executed in the very space designed for safety and intimacy, exposes a truth often overlooked, that control, whether over fame, fortune, or family, is fragile, and that the most devastating threats often come not from strangers but from those we trust implicitly. Fragson's death was immediate, but the echoes lingered. A father institutionalized, a grieving public, and a narrative of success brutally interrupted by human frailty and obsession. When we consider his story alongside Harriet Staunton, Ernest Austin, and Louise Peete, a pattern emerges. Victimhood is not always random, and human behavior can be weaponized within both intimate and public spheres. Fragson's story forces us to confront the intersection of mental instability, societal expectation, and familial control, showing how even individuals who appear to command their environment can be undone by unseen psychological forces. This is the subtlety of human darkness. It is not always violent in the traditional sense, yet it leaves devastation in its wake, rewriting lives in ways that are irrevocable. The lesson here is clear. When you peel back the layers of history, you see that danger often lives in plain sight, disguised as love, loyalty, or normalcy. As we continue our descent into these forbidden truths, remember this: the architecture of control, social and familial, is both pervasive and insidious. It shapes lives, dictates outcomes, and often determines who survives and who falls. Stay vigilant, for the next story will immerse us in the intricate, manipulative genius of Louise Peete, the serial killer who returned from prison only to reclaim control, using trust and deception as lethal weapons. Now we return to the chilling saga of Louise Peete, a woman whose crimes reveal the terrifying power of charm, manipulation, and strategic patience, a blueprint of predation wrapped in civility. Pete's life was a masterclass in exploitation. She understood trust, she understood society's blind spots, and she weaponized them to deadly effect. From her earliest years, patterns emerged: stealing, deception, and the careful cultivation of personas designed to gain sympathy and access. But it was in Los Angeles, decades later, that her genius for manipulation would manifest in its most lethal form. After serving 18 years for the murder of Jacob Denton, she was paroled, legally changed her name, and re-entered society as if nothing had happened. Yet the tools she had developed, psychological control, deception, and the exploitation of social systems, were intact and sharper than ever. Her next victims, elderly and trusting, allowed her into their lives because she appeared harmless, nurturing, even devoted. Margaret Logan, the woman who would become Pete's second murder victim, welcomed her as a housekeeper, a nurse, and, eventually, as a confidant. Peete observed, calculated, and waited. She understood the vulnerabilities of her victims: age, trust, reliance, and the blind faith in human decency. When Margaret disappeared, Peete controlled the narrative with cold precision, deflecting suspicion, managing perception, and allowing months to pass before discovery would reveal the depth of her crime. Arthur Logan's death followed, conveniently removing another witness while maintaining Pete's carefully constructed persona. She had mastered the art of invisibility, not by hiding in shadows, but by existing within plain sight, manipulating every observer, every system, every assumption to her advantage. This is the darkest lesson of her life, that evil does not always roar. It often whispers, smiles, and waits patiently for the perfect alignment of opportunity and trust. Her eventual conviction and execution were delayed by decades of charm, deception, and social manipulation. Peete demonstrates that the most dangerous predators are not only those who strike with brute force, like Austin, but also those who strike with intellect, patience, and the ability to bend the human perception of normality. As you reflect on Peete's story, ask yourself how many people in positions of trust, of influence, or even of affection might be quietly manipulating, exploiting, or controlling those around them. And more importantly, how often do the systems we rely on, legal, social, familial, fail to detect the subtle, patient machinery of predation? Pause and consider this. And now, I want you to engage. Comment below the phrase "I see the hidden" twice, wherever you are watching from, and recognize that awareness itself is the first shield against the machinery of manipulation that we will continue to explore. The descent is not over. The next section will confront the systemic failures and societal complicity that allow these predators to operate, unchecked, in plain sight. As we continue our descent into forbidden history, it becomes clear that these crimes are not merely individual acts of depravity, they are also reflections of systemic failure, institutional blindness, and societal complicity. Harriet Staunton's death, for example, exposes a network of cruelty hidden beneath the guise of family loyalty and social decorum. Locked away in a small upstairs room with her child, starved and threatened, Harriet's suffering was overlooked not only by those around her, but by a society unprepared or unwilling to intervene. Her father's attempts to protect her were thwarted by legal structures designed to maintain appearances. The Court of Chancery prioritizing property and inheritance over the preservation of life. When Harriet died, the initial records attempted to obscure the truth, citing cerebral disease instead of starvation and neglect. A chilling reminder that institutional reporting can sanitize horror to preserve reputation. Similarly, Ernest Austin's crime unfolded in a community dependent on trust and routine. The isolated farming roads, the reliance on observation rather than forensic science, and the gaps in law enforcement allowed a methodical predator to operate with impunity until the evidence became undeniable. His meticulous efforts to erase traces, altered boots, washed hands, calculated escape routes, highlight how intelligence and patience can exploit societal and technological limitations. Louise Peete's manipulations, however, reveal another layer: the failures of parole systems, social networks, and human credulity. Despite a prior conviction for murder, she was reintegrated into society, welcomed into homes, trusted with money and care, and allowed to operate with the subtlety of a predator studying her prey. These failures are not random. They are structural. They emerge from gaps in oversight, reliance on assumptions about human behavior, and the misplaced belief that previous punishment guarantees future safety. And in the case of Harry Fragson, we confront a different, yet equally insidious form of human vulnerability: the psychological control wielded within families. His father's delusions and violent outburst were a private horror, invisible to the outside world, yet lethal. The intersection of mental instability, societal expectation, and intimate access creates a space where danger thrives unseen, echoing the hidden cruelty experienced by Harriet Staunton or the patient manipulation of Peete. As we examine these cases side by side, the pattern is undeniable. Societal systems, legal, familial, or communal, frequently fail to anticipate the intelligence, patience, and subtlety of those who would exploit them. The darkness is both individual and systemic, personal and structural, immediate and enduring. Consider this carefully, for understanding these failures is not mere historical curiosity, it is a lesson in vigilance, a guide to recognizing the subtle forms of manipulation, control, and deception that permeate human structures. And now, take a moment, comment below from where you are watching. Recognize that awareness is the first step in confronting the machinery of control and predation that operates around us daily. This is not a story of mere horror, it is a study in human systems, predation, and the shadows that dwell in plain sight. Now, as we approach the final stages of our descent into these dark histories, we confront the unsettling truth that evil is often cyclical, evolving, and adaptive. Consider the ways in which Louise Peete operated. Each crime, each deception, was an iteration refined by experience, guided by observation, and executed with a cold precision honed over decades. She was not impulsive. She was methodical. From Jacob Denton to Margaret Logan, she understood human psychology, trust, and the systems meant to protect society, and she exploited every flaw. Her intelligence, patience, and audacity reveal a predator who is not only dangerous but terrifyingly human. Similarly, Ernest Austin demonstrated how meticulous preparation and an understanding of environmental vulnerabilities can amplify destructive potential. Every crime committed in this narrative is a study in control. Control of perception, control of narrative, control of access, and, ultimately, control of life and death. Even in Harry Fragson's tragic end, the danger lies not in malice alone, but in the subtle tyranny of perception and fear within domestic spaces. One man, deluded and mentally unwell, converted familial proximity into fatal power, illustrating that control can manifest in unpredictable and devastating ways. Harriet Staunton's story, however, remains perhaps the most haunting for its intersection of innocence, systemic neglect, and deliberate cruelty. It is a reminder that the powerless, those deemed weak or incapable, are most vulnerable to the machinery of human exploitation, and that societal structures often fail to recognize danger until it is too late. Together, these cases expose a layered reality. The predators are real, but so too are the failures of those who should prevent them. These histories are not merely about murder, they are about deception, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust at every level. And here lies the forbidden truth. Darkness is rarely isolated. It thrives where oversight is absent, where trust is unexamined, where institutions and individuals alike ignore subtle warning signs until catastrophe becomes inevitable. By understanding these patterns, by acknowledging the systematic vulnerabilities and human tendencies that allowed these crimes to occur, we are not merely recounting history, we are gaining the tools to see hidden danger, to question appearances, and to anticipate deception in forms both mundane and extraordinary. These lessons are not theoretical, they are practical, psychological, and deeply unsettling. As we prepare for the final chapter, reflect on the depth of human ingenuity for both creation and destruction. Recognize the shadows cast by human ambition, desire, and obsession. And remember, the world is rarely as safe as it appears. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below, because the final revelation is coming, and it will challenge everything you thought you knew about human nature control, and the invisible machinery of fear that operates just beyond your awareness. This is the penultimate descent, the moment where the truths we have uncovered collide into a stark, unflinching reality. Human malevolence is both opportunistic and enduring, and the systems meant to contain it are fragile, flawed, and easily manipulated. Louise Peete's final act, executed in California's gas chamber, was not just the end of a life, but the culmination of decades of manipulation, deception, and exploitation, a chilling reminder that patience and cunning can extend the reach of evil far beyond immediate perception. Her victims, like Harriet Staunton and Margaret Logan, were ensnared not because they were careless, but because society assumed safety where none existed. The fragile veil of civility, the unexamined assumptions of trust, and the misallocation of attention allowed predators to operate within plain sight, often leaving behind a trail of horror that history struggles to fully reconcile. Ernest Austin's methodical stalking of Ivy Mitchell, his understanding of rural isolation, and his meticulous removal of evidence illustrates a different facet of this same truth, that intelligence, cunning, and patience magnify the danger of the individual, and yet societal vigilance often lags behind. Harry Fragson's death, caused by the hand of a deranged parent, demonstrates another dimension, the dangers inherent in intimate proximity. In relationships where unmonitored psychological instability intersects with emotional dependence, these narratives collectively expose a haunting principle. Evil is rarely obvious, rarely immediate, and frequently disguised beneath layers of normalcy, charm, and perceived trustworthiness. The structural vulnerabilities in law, community, and family are exploited relentlessly, highlighting a persistent failure of institutions to detect, predict, or mitigate malevolent intent. As we reflect on these cases together, a broader pattern emerges. The darkness is systematic, adaptive, and relational. It exploits human tendencies toward trust, distraction, and assumption. It preys upon isolation, naivety, and social gaps, and it endures precisely because it evolves to exploit the blind spots that humans and their systems cannot anticipate. Here, in the shadows of these histories, lies a deeper lesson. Awareness is the first line of defense. Recognize the subtle, the patient, the calculated. Observe the patterns where trust is weaponized, vulnerability exploited, and systems manipulated. Engage with this knowledge, not as passive observers, but as informed participants in a world where darkness can dwell in any corner, behind any smile, and within the structures we rely upon to protect us. And now, before the final descent, reflect. You have journeyed far into the forbidden, witnessed cruelty, cunning, and systemic failure. Comment below one phrase that symbolizes your awakening knowledge, the truths you have seen, and prepare yourself for the last revelation that will crystallize this exploration of human malevolence into an indelible understanding of fear, control, and the hidden machinery of history itself. Now we arrive at the final descent, the culmination of a journey through the darkest recesses of human history. Crime and deception, place where the threads of horror, manipulation, and systemic failure converge into a single, undeniable truth. Evil thrives not only in the hearts of men and women, but in the spaces between vigilance and assumption, in the blind spots of society, and within the mechanisms we trust to protect us. Harriet Staunton's tragic death, starved and confined under the pretense of family duty, reveals the chilling consequences of institutional neglect and the ease with which cruelty can be sanctioned by legal and social frameworks. Ernest Austin's meticulous hunting of Ivy Mitchell in the rural isolation of Queensland shows us that calculated malevolence is amplified when observation replaces action, when procedure lags behind predation, and when communities are unprepared for the intelligence of a predator. Louise Peete's decades-long pattern of deceit, murder, and manipulation demonstrates how adaptive, patient evil can exploit trust repeatedly, thriving even after exposure, imprisonment, and parole. Her ability to infiltrate households, manipulate financial and social systems, and evade immediate detection exemplifies the terrifying persistence of human cunning. And Harry Fragson's death, at the hands of his own father, reminds us that danger often exists closest to home. In intimate relationships where psychological instability and unchecked delusions become lethal. Together, these cases illuminate a recurring principle. The machinery of darkness is systematic, intelligent, and adaptive, exploiting weaknesses in both human nature and societal systems. Every story, every victim, and every perpetrator is a lesson in vigilance. Trust must be measured. Systems must be questioned, and assumptions about safety cannot be accepted without scrutiny. As we close this exploration, consider this. These are not isolated events, frozen in history. They are reflections of patterns that continue to exist today, echoing in modern systems of governance, in communities, in families, and even within our own personal choices. Darkness is patient, evil is adaptive, systems are flawed. Awareness is the weapon that can pierce the veil of ignorance, and knowledge is the shield against repetition of these horrors. You have seen the truths hidden in plain sight, witnessed the consequences of manipulation, deceit, and systemic failure. Carry this understanding forward, not as fear, but as insight. Share it, discuss it, and embed it into your perception of the world. If this journey has unsettled you, let it awaken vigilance. If it has fascinated you, let it sharpen awareness. And now, as we leave these shadows behind, take action, like this video, share it to illuminate the dark corners of history for others, and subscribe to continue descending into forbidden knowledge, confronting hidden truths, and understanding the machinery of human malevolence that lurks in every era, unseen but ever present.